What happens when truth stands before power and refuses to fight on its own terms? When integrity faces corruption and still stays centered? That's what we see in this scene. The restraint of Jesus in the face of deliberate injustice. If he wanted to establish his kingdom through force and revenge and control, he could have, but he didn't. And he modeled a different kind of strength in this scene. The kind that exposes injustice, not through retaliation and revenge and vengeance, but through calm endurance. What's up, everybody? I'm Tyson Putthoff, and this is scene 25 of the JesusX30 challenge. We're walking through scene by scene my 3-volume book project called Jesus, the Strategic Life and Mission of the Messiah and His Movement. All 3 volumes are out in print and in ebook. Go get your copies wherever you buy your books. If you check them out through public library apps like Hoopla or Overdrive, grab a copy and follow along. You don't want to miss what we're dealing with in these final scenes. So this scene walks us through the series of hearings, the trials that led to Jesus' crucifixion. Each stage, Annas, Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, Pilate, shows how systems of power defend themselves when they're threatened. Because that's what, at the end of the day, is happening here. Jesus was a threat to the systems of wealth and power and privilege and nationalism that had long benefited those at the top of society in the name of God. And he came along and he threatened it. And so this scene uncovers the injustice, the unfairness that the system is established to keep people like Jesus at bay. And yet, through all of this, Jesus never loses his composure. The Gospels describe the first line of questioning that taking place in the private home of Annas in John 18. So Annas was the former high priest, so he was the most powerful figure in the priestly system at one point. But at this point, he's kind of like a godfather figure. He's still the most influential figure in the temple hierarchy. He's that politician who's done and said it all and accomplished it all in the world of politics, but who now enjoys life but pulls the strings from behind the scenes. So this first trial, the meeting wasn't actually a legal trial. It was purely for the sake of intimidation. So Nas asks about Jesus's disciples and his teachings, and he's hoping to find grounds for a charge. They don't have a formal charge brought against Jesus at this point, but he's hoping to conjure one up. And Jesus' response is pretty simple. I've spoken openly to the world, ask those who heard me. He's reminding them that his public campaign had always been public. It had always been out in the broad daylight, in the wide open spaces, unlike the secretive politics of his accusers, which is some of the irony here. So a guard strikes him, tries to reassert control because in this moment, Jesus has utilized this social gameplay where one person challenges another publicly. We've talked a lot about it. Annas challenges Jesus publicly. Jesus responds in a way that essentially defeats Annas in this verbal gameplay. So in order to reassert control, a guard punches Jesus. They start to see, even in this moment, the power that they have over Jesus is starting to unravel. And Jesus's restraint stood as a sort of a quiet authority in this situation. So next is Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, the formal council. Mark 14 explains that this is a nighttime meeting, which actually broke multiple legal norms and customs. Capital offense cases couldn't be held after dark. And that's basically what they're putting him on trial for. Verdicts couldn't be rushed, and testimonies had to agree. The importance of testimonies, we see that in the biblical account all through, even in the 10 Commandments. Don't bring a false testimony against someone else. It was critically important, really up until modern times, to rely on personal testimonies against someone, right? You could have 1 or 2 witnesses, and that was enough to bring determination against someone, because you didn't have cameras, you didn't have email accounts, you didn't have text threads, right? You couldn't go get DNA in a crime. You didn't have all this other evidence, so you relied heavily on testimonies. And in this case, They didn't have any of this. And the testimonies they had didn't agree, but the council presses forward, and they're determined to legitimize a decision that they had already made. It was already a pronouncement of Jesus being guilty, but now they had to stir up some witnesses, some evidence. So when they fail to do all of this, they start to twist Jesus's early statements about the temple, that the ones he said in John 2 at the very beginning of his public campaign, and then even more recently he sort of repeated this public act of condemnation against the temple system. And so they start to grasp at some of these moments where people who've been watching Jesus have gathered together some testimonies to try to bring some kind of accusation against Jesus. And so Caiaphas finally comes out and he asks, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" And Jesus answers cleverly, "You've said it yourself. But I tell you, you're going to see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." So that's Matthew 26:64. And right there, he's quoting Daniel 7, a really well-known text in the ancient Jewish world. And Daniel 7 in this text is describing this vision of divine enthronement, where God's envoy, right, his chosen one, is gonna retake the throne and rule on it from there. And so Jesus is quoting that in the context of asking about who he is, but he doesn't come out and say, "Yes, I'm the Messiah." He leads them to conclude that, knowing that if he indicts himself, he's in trouble right there. But he puts all of the onus, all of the blame, all of the pressure on them at this point, and he keeps it on them. So the high priest calls it blasphemy. Actually, Jesus has just claimed the kind of authority that no earthly system can either grant or take away. So it doesn't matter what they say. He's just claimed it, and now they're in a position where they have to do something about this. All along, Peter is the one who kind of sticks around. Remember? So Peter is outside, and he's waiting in the courtyards. And this is when Peter denies Jesus 3 times. When the rooster crows, Luke 22:61 says that Jesus turns and looks at him. So they're close enough to be in viewing distance of one another. And that's a tough moment. Jesus has been abandoned. He saw it coming, but he's been abandoned by all of his closest followers, his disciples, the people that he's been mentoring and raising up for these moments have all left him. Peter has kind of hung around. He tried to defend Jesus in the garden, but he's still out there. And then in front of everyone, including Jesus himself, he says, "No, I don't know the man." And he starts really getting animated and heated. "I absolutely don't know anything about him. I'm not connected with him. He's on his own." And Jesus, right there in that moment, looks at Peter. I don't think it's a moment where Jesus looks at Peter and condemns him. I think it's a moment where, in the reality of the situation, Jesus understood Peter just blew it, and the guilt and shame that he's going to carry for himself is enough that from this moment on, Peter will never falter in this way again. And so Jesus remains steady, and he's done what he can up until this moment to prep Peter and the other disciples for these types of situations. It's going to carry him through for the rest of their lives as they expand his empire, his kingdom, as far as they possibly can. So it's dawn. And at this point, the council brings Jesus to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, famous Pilate. Under Roman law, they can't actually execute someone for blasphemy. So what ends up happening here is Jesus's opponents, his accusers, actually shift their accusation. So the Romans don't care if someone who's a part of one of their subjugated people groups, like the Jewish people were, and like a lot of other localized populations were in the Roman world at this time. They don't care if someone in that population blasphemes against that local population's God. So they're not going to go and execute someone for some religious difference. And this is just an aside. There was never anyone ever in the history of ancient Rome that Rome hung on a cross for making bad claims about a god or bad religious claims. The only people they ever crucified were political insurgents and people along those lines, military enemies. Okay, that's important because Jesus is hung on a cross. And right now, he's been accused of blasphemy, so more of a religious type of a category of offense. Rome doesn't care about that. So Jesus' accusers shift it to make it into a political thing. And they say, well, okay, he blasphemed, but he's also a political rebel. He's claimed to be king in opposition to Caesar, the king of the world. That's Luke 23. So Pilate actually asks him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus actually replies, you say so. And instead of, again, just coming out and declaring it, he invites Pilate and everyone around into a moment of reflection, I think. He's not here to argue. He's not here to play these power games. He's just gonna leave that moment with them so they can decide what Jesus said. They have to work through the arguments and they can decide if they want to believe it or not. And so Pilate, he says, look, I don't find any guilt in this guy. So Pilate gives in to some of the political pressure on the one hand, but he also doesn't find fault in what Jesus has done. When he learns Jesus is from Galilee, he sends him up to Herod Antipas. So Herod Antipas was the local puppet ruler, the Jewish puppet ruler, son of Herod the Great, one of 4 sons of Herods who took over the region of Judea and Samaria and the Galilee. Basically, he decides, this is out of my jurisdiction. I'm going to send him to the ruler over the area in which Jesus allegedly launched his revolution, which is the Galilee. Herod Antipas is the ruler over that region. Herod Antipas wants a miracle. He mocks Jesus. He dresses him in a robe. He sends him back to Pilate, but all along he mocks him. And Jesus continues to remain silent. And Luke notes that that day, that very moment, Herod and Pilate became friends. And we see this in politics, right? 2 people hate each other their entire lives. And then all of a sudden, when one of them gets into a position of power and the other one still wants to be relevant in a position of power, they become buddies all of a sudden. This is what happens here. Herod and Pilate don't like each other, but today their shared disrespect and hatred of Jesus and this new revolutionary movement that Jesus has been stirring about, they become friends. So we're back in front of Pilate. Pilate part 2, right? And at this point, the priests start to stir the crowd. They've got to get rid of Jesus because their power, their authority, their wealth has been undermined by Jesus for the last 2 years. And Pilate is still not convinced. So he tries to negotiate this peace by offering to release another prisoner, which was a Passover tradition that someone would be released from being arrested by the Roman authorities. There's this guy named Barabbas. He's a known rebel and a murderer, and the people choose Barabbas to be released from arrest over Jesus. And so Pilate, he's already been in hot water with the Roman authorities back in Rome. So he's kind of starting to want to distance himself from what's happening here. So he washes his hands, a symbolic gesture of innocence. But he still goes ahead and authorizes this release of Barabbas and to continue the proceedings toward crucifixion in Jesus's account. And I want to stop here. This is important to note. Okay. So your English translation probably doesn't do this account justice, this Barabbas versus Jesus account. Barabbas was not a thief. He was a revolutionary. He was a rebel, either leading or participating in an uprising that literally sought to overthrow the Roman authorities. And when he was caught by the Roman authorities, he was automatically condemned to death. So that's what Rome did. If you remained peaceful, they treated your people group, your region, under Roman occupation pretty well. I mean, it wasn't the life anyone desired, but if you remained peaceful, they would treat you with peace. But here's the thing. Jesus was a rebel leader too. Have you ever thought about that? It's not like Barabbas was on trial for starting a new revolution for sedition against Rome, and Jesus, contrarily, was on trial for starting a new religious movement and making religious claims that the authorities disagreed with. Both were enemies of the state because both were involved in revolution against the Roman authorities. The difference was that Barabbas promised something that the people wanted, violent revolt. Jesus didn't. Jesus and Barabbas both proclaimed revolution and liberation, but Jesus modeled a different way to overthrowing oppressive regimes. And when faced with a choice between a violent rebel in Barabbas or a peaceful and self-sacrificing rebel in Jesus, the crowd, like I think most of us today, they made their choice. We want Barabbas. Before the execution, the soldiers continue to beat and they mock Jesus, and they press the crown of thorns onto his head, and they dress him in purple, and they mock his claim to kingship. But the irony in all of this is that what they're using to mock Jesus is actually true. He is king, but his reign is expressed not through the power and the coercion and the violence that kings of this world take to achieve and maintain power, and that even good governments use to maintain power even today. Jesus, as a king, achieved his authority and continued and maintained his authority through suffering and love and self-sacrifice. What they tried to do to mock him actually, ironically, reaffirmed his kingship. So Pilate presents him to the crowd and he says, "Hey, behold this man," John 19. And the phrase, again, he's intending to mock Jesus, but this is kind of a cryptic declaration. Here is humanity as God intended it. Behold the man, behold the human. John 19:5. He's trying to say this is all he is. But the theology of it is that this is what true humanity should look like. Loving self-sacrifice, even to the point of death on behalf of others who can't help themselves. And then comes the final rejection. So Pilate asks, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the priests, in this sort of moment of betrayal, even to their own vocation and their own people, they respond, "We have no king but Caesar." So they're desperate to preserve their institution and align themselves fully with the empire at that moment. In trying to maintain their power, they actually surrender the very truth they were called to serve. And that is the truth that there is no king but the God of Israel, the king of the universe. And so this whole trial sequence ends with silence and compromise on all sides, religious, political, social, personal. Every character in the story, other than Jesus, tries to manage the risk involved and preserve self. Jesus is the only one who truly embodies peace. And his silence is often looked at as kind of a moment of defeat, but it's not. And we think of passiveness as weakness in our alpha male, violent, power hungry culture. But Jesus' silence isn't any kind of defeat. This is true discipline. This is true strength. He refuses to mirror the violence and aggression around him. And his restraint only reveals the emptiness of their authority and of the world's view of power. I think that's a good lesson for us, that when we face this unfairness and misunderstanding, our instinct is often to fight, right? We want to fight for control, fight for vindication, get revenge. And I think Jesus shows us another way. He demonstrates that true power doesn't depend on winning arguments or overpowering opponents. It lies in staying grounded in the truth, even when the outcome looks unjust, even when it looks like everything is unfair around us. We might call this something like response over reaction, the ability to choose calm and clarity instead of panic. And in spiritual terms, I think we could call this trust, faith. Jesus trusted that God's timing and justice were enough to allow him to stand silent when when he knew that words weren't going to help. Nothing he could say would have fixed the situation, but only would have fueled the fire of this violent and power-hungry approach to leadership and to rule and to kingship. And his strength was clearly not submission to evil, but it was confidence in his larger purpose, his greater purpose on earth. I think when truth and integrity are tested in our own lives, when political, social, religious, economic systems favor comfort and power over our own conscience, or when doing the right thing costs us something, I think we need to remember this scene, that we don't have to mirror the injustice of the world to expose it. We don't have to adopt their tactics. We don't have to go and shame people and abuse people and inflict pain on people to expose the injustice of this world. That's what the world does. That's what even good governments do to maintain power. Jesus gives us a different way right here in this moment, that sometimes restraint, steady faith, quiet courage speak louder than outrage ever could. And the verdict that day was clearly wrong, but the verdict in heaven was already being written, that the world condemned an innocent man. But in the same moment, the true king revealed what real power looks like. Cool Mod, go and learn. Come back for scene 26 of the JesusX30 challenge.